Perception of nicotine among high school athletes by us. So, introduction. Nicotine use among adolescents has become one of the most pressing public health concerns in the United States, affecting both physical health and cognitive development. In 2023, the CDC reported that 2.8 million people in the U.S. have used nicotine products in middle school and high school students, which underscores the vast problem that exists today. What makes this trend even more concerning, though, is the rise among high school athletes, where they're viewed as as symbols of health. Yet, a study by the University of Georgia found that students who exercise 4 to 5 days per week were 23% more likely to use nicotine than their less active peers. This paradox reveals how deeply nicotine has infiltrated youth culture, extending even into environments meant to promote strength and well-being. The growing prevalence of vaping among athletes reflects a mix of social, cultural, and psychological pressures. Many young athletes face intense competition, high performance expectations, and academic stress. For some, nicotine seems to offer a quick way to manage anxiety or improve focus, despite its proven harm to cardiovascular function, endurance, and recovery. Within team settings, social norms can make vaping feel acceptable or even part of group identity, turning locker rooms and practices into spaces where use becomes normalized. This issue has become even more urgent as vaping culture expands around both real-world and digital sports communities. Online platforms amplify trends and shape perceptions, often portraying vaping as harmless or fashionable. At the same time, many coaches and athletic programs underestimate nicotine's dangers, leaving prevention efforts weak or absent. As a result, countless adolescents remain unaware of the long-term physical and cognitive risks associated with nicotine exposure during critical development years. Despite growing concern, little research has examined how team culture, peer influence, and coach attitudes specifically affect nicotine use among high school athletes. Understanding these social dynamics is crucial to developing prevention and intervention strategies that truly align with the realities of sports culture. Confronting this issue is not about reducing substance use. It's about safeguarding the health, motivations, and potential of a generation that represents the future of athletic and community leadership. This leads to our research question: how do team culture, peer norms, and coach attitudes influence high school athletes' motivations and perceptions toward vaping and nicotine use?
So now on to the literature review. As Kendall stated, this is becoming a growing concern that is only going up and up with every subsequent year. A national survey published by Tobacco Control in 2020 reported that e-cigarette use among U.S. high school students has increased from 11.7% to 27.5% between 2017 and 2019. Now, we all know that vaping leads to a bunch of health concerns, but we need to contextualize this. And a study done by Tarani et al. In 2020 tells you that vaping carries risks pertinent to all users. Nicotine dependence, which can impair sleep, attention, and recovery, increase susceptibility to respiratory infections and possible cardiopulmonary harms from increased nicotine use. With potential harms in mind, it is quite shocking that Mundo and Jones, in their 2006 study written in the Journal of Sports Medicine, discovered that nicotine use is actually higher among athletes than the general population. Studies have also examined vaping in athletic context and how it is harmful for their performance. Zigdaloo in 2023 wrote in Sports Medicine Open that nicotine can negatively impact athletic performance, reducing focus, endurance, and sleep. Now, that's pretty broad, but a study done by Simonovich et al. In 2024 tells you about the growing field that is actively researching the harms that nicotine use is doing to these students. It has been found that there are measurable decrements in cardiorespiratory function and fitness in young users. Studies reported that reduced cardiorespiratory fitness, increased breathlessness, poor performance on exercise tests among regular vapers when compared to non-users, with users experiencing airway inflammation, impaired oxygen transport, and transient cardiovascular effects of nicotine. These physiological findings have given validity to athletes' reports that vaping hinders training, recovery, and fitness. Now, with that being in mind, the statistic of athletes using vaping more on average than regular students doesn't really make that much sense. Because to be good at athletics is contingent on your health and your performance. However, a recent study from Biles et al. In 2025 shows that some athletes may use vaping as a coping strategy or as an appetite suppressant. They're highlighted under peer introduction, flavor appeal, and short-term social benefits. However, throughout all of our research, we have not found a study that actually examines the gap in our study, which is the social aspect of this. While existing studies help to explain the general youth vaping trends, there are still major gaps in the research. Very few studies focus specifically on high school athletes, with most of our evidence being contextualized to colleges. There's also limited research on how team culture, peer norms, and coaches' attitude might influence these behaviors independently within high school athletic situations beyond the normal peer pressure and introductory methods. Social factors such as stigma or acceptance within specific athletic environments have rarely been examined, and overall researchers have yet to clearly link athletic identity to how young athletes perceive risk and addiction, leaving an important gap in which we hope to fill.
So for our methods, our research design, we used a qualitative interview study, specifically using focus groups. We did use interviews because, as Hammerberg et al. Says, interviews are the best way to find like a complex contextual information, especially from people. And mainly we wanted to focus on how high school athletes actually perceive nicotine use, not the amount of nicotine use among high school athletes. So what we did was we examined team culture and environment influences, so of different traditions, coaches, other impacts, and how that influences perceptions. Our participants, we used student athletes from Brophy College Preparatory that came from a multitude of sports. This includes football, rugby, crew, hockey, and soccer. And the way we designed this is we had 5 athletes per focus group, and they were grouped by sport. We did this to kind of create a sense of trust and hopefully answer some questions over shared experiences throughout these sports. And then finally, our participants were selected through prior connections, so there's already rapport and trust to kind of try and hope to get honest answers in a case where students wouldn't be open to answering. Our data focus was mainly on their perceptions of nicotine and influencing factors, and actually how these athletes talked about nicotine, because we believe that this is the deepest way to realize their beliefs and the social pressures that they face. We use a semi-structured interview guide to keep each session consistent, but still allow for some open discussion with flexible questions. And some of these questions consisted on asking athletes how they defined nicotine addiction, or perhaps how they saw nicotine use among their peers on their team. And finally, our procedure, we conducted our interviews in quiet, private rooms, and then we recorded these interviews and transcribed them for later analysis. And this analysis that we used is qualitative thematic coding. So among the interviews, we looked for common perceptions across sports to kind of see how high school athletes at the same school would perceive nicotine and nicotine use among their peers. We also looked to know any sport-specific beliefs. So if either the rugby team or the soccer team had any belief that they held and no other team did. And we also looked for recurring language among teams and athletes to reveal deeper cultural norms.
All right. These were our 5 main findings after analyzing our results. The first one was that team culture strongly shapes nicotine use. Teams with close-knit, disciplined cultures, such as soccer or crew, reported almost no nicotine use, emphasizing shared accountability and team pride. One soccer player said that the team is a family with almost no peer pressure, while crew athletes said that using nicotine would let the team down. In contrast, rugby athletes described more divided norms, estimating that 25 to 35% of players use nicotine, and noting that acceptability depended on which team you were on. Our second finding was that coach engagement reduces risk. Active, communicative coaches, especially younger ones, were seen as effective in preventing use. Soccer players said that their assistant coach educates them on what will hinder their performance, and crew athletes described strong coach-driven expectations for discipline and for health. Our third finding was that peer norms can encourage or prevent use. Throughout the focus groups, peer approval played a large role in shaping the attitudes towards nicotine. Rugby players reported that some athletes vape to fit in with teammates who use nicotine. crew athletes, on the other hand, said friends actively remind each other not to do nicotine, creating a protective peer norm. Our fourth finding was that nicotine is mainly seen as harmful to performance. Athletes across all sports agree that nicotine damages stamina, focus, and recovery. One rugby athlete linked it to tightened blood vessels and slower recovery, while a crew member said it changes your focus from your sport to nicotine. There is some nuance to this though, since some viewed it as not negative. Some viewed it as a performance enhancer, like some kids on soccer did. They said that due to its stimulant nature, it may not be fully negative. Our final finding was that education and prevention must be athlete-led. Multiple teams said that prevention programs would be more effective if they were led by younger people or peers rather than administrators. Athletes suggested open discussions and relatable role models to make the issue less stigmatized and more impactful.
Now to analyze these findings. So we found that the findings from our research do reveal that team culture, peer norms, and coach attitudes have a big fact of the perception of high school athletes. And also the results reveal that team culture especially has a big impact. Like we see, as Cooper talked about, the soccer team, they're really focused on health, strong discipline, and accountability between teammates. So the athletes in these sports are much less likely to view nicotine as acceptable or even beneficial, and therefore are less likely to use it. But when we look at a different team like the rugby team, where some athletes can view it as more common and more socially acceptable, it does become more socially acceptable then, and higher use, as we've seen. And this really reveals that team culture can either have a beneficial impact or be a risk factor for nicotine use. These results also align with our previous research, as we saw, because previous research revealed that peer influence and social identity are key to predictors of high school nicotine use. But our data goes beyond this to show that athletic cultures differ greatly, even in the same context of the same school. While Mundell looked at the physiological effects of nicotine and how that could influence athletes, our study more focused on the culture of a sport and the culture of a school that could influence perceptions. And also the implications of our research are very large, especially for coaches, administrators, and athletic directors. Preventative efforts haven't been working as much because youth use of nicotine is still growing. But with our findings, coaches can incorporate brief discussions among peers and among teammates to kind of get that peer influence of nicotine down and hopefully discourage nicotine use among students. Despite our solid data, we found that there were a few limitations of our study. First of all, it's a small sample size. Because we only sampled Brophy, it can't really be generalized to sports across the nation. And also, because Brophy is only male, we didn't get any female perceptions of nicotine, so that cuts off a big limitation. We also relied on self-reported data and an environment where students might not be comfortable sharing how they truly feel about nicotine or their relationship with it. So future research should go broader, and yeah.
So the conclusion. Everyone in this room knows that nicotine is harmful for you. We can give you even more data points to prove this. But what can we actually do to prevent this nicotine use, especially in the context of an athletic setting? And that is encouraging a positive team culture and having coaches actively shape beliefs and roles. The old adage that we are the sum of the 5 closest people around us has proven to be true time and time again, and we are proving it to be true right here, right now. If every coach on this campus actively encourages a positive team culture, in which it is one of building us up together and not tearing others apart at the seams, and showing and giving education as to why vaping is not a positive, is a net negative, not only on social, emotional states, but athletic performance can greatly reduce instead of deterrent methods which historically have not been working via the data. Strong, disciplined teams need engaged coaches, and it requires a certain amount of buy-in from everyone. You cannot have a good team culture if some people choose not to participate, and that should be facilitated by the culture. Prevention starts with culture. It must go beyond health education. Everyone has heard or has been taught that vaping is bad, yet it is still happening right now and damaging the future lives of our youth. And that is why an active role in the culture from not only teammates to hold their other teammates accountable, but from coaches as well is a necessity. And we must expand efforts to include diverse teams, genders in schools, doing this research to make sure that it is verified across the boundaries, as Brophy is a very small and very narrow sample size to what high school athletics looks like. And that leads us to our call to action. First, for coaches, need to model and reinforce these health-centered views to help create a better culture with teams, one in which we feel unity and people feel safe about talking about nicotine and the ways in which they feel peer pressure, and to create a culture in which peer pressure is not prevalent to the extent. Teammates must hold each other accountable, not shame or encourage people to vape, but talk about the problems much more openly and realize that it is not going to be beneficial. Then finally, schools need to make this culture a part of their prevention program. Deterrence efforts, if they had worked, we would be seeing a decline in the amount of students vaping. But according to the data, that is not the case. Factoring in the ways in which culture and the social norms play into nicotine usage and prevention needs to start. Change begins in the locker room. One conversation, one standard, and one team at a time. Thank you.